Welcome to the Fantasy Football League podcast. I am your host, Aiden, and today I'm riding solo. This podcast will cover the coveted Fantasy Football League, my fantasy football league with 11 of my friends, as we go through the year and ultimately find out who is worthy of the crown. We will have trials and tribulations that will all be covered here. So strap in and spread those eyeballs, because you're about to witness the best fantasy football coverage you've ever seen. Weekly, I will be covering the Fantasy Football League, but I will not be alone most weeks, as the other owners will be able to come on and complain about their week or trash talk their next opponent. So the league settings of the Fantasy Football League are pretty standard for a fantasy football league. It is full PPR, so it is going to be a little higher scoring than maybe a half PPR, but it is a little bit of a smaller roster size. There's 13 spots on the roster, 8 starters. So the starting positions, 1 QB, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, but 2 flex. So it is interesting. You have a lot of flexibility with your starting lineup. You can start 4 receivers, you can start 4 running backs, you can start 3 tight ends if you really want to, but I don't think that's the best strategy. And then you only have 5 bench spots. So the bench is going to be really key in developing your talent over the long haul, really utilizing all 5 bench spots. You're not going to be wanting to hog your bench up with multiple QBs if you already have a starting QB. At least that's my opinion. I know some people love to have their second QB even though they never play them and usually end up cutting them after a couple weeks when they want to pick up a different player. Also, we do have an IR spot. We have 2 IR spots on the roster, but they are not reserved for out players. You can only put players on if they're in the IR. So I do think it's going to be a little more challenging and a little more skillful to hold those roster spots on the bench and have the depth that you need throughout the year. So let's get started by going through the drafted teams and putting them in a tier list, which I've actually already made. So you can see that right now. This is a tier list based on the maximum points possible projected per team. So for example, if a team has a player that's projected higher on the bench, I went ahead and put that player in their starting lineup. So it's easier to see how much they would be projected if they wanted to start that player. So let's start off with Totally Offensive's team, which has Amon-Ra St. Brown in the first round. They are projected 116.08. So essentially I'm going to be using this as like the power rankings to see which teams are projected the most each week. And I think it's an easy way to rank the teams without me adding my own bias into the rankings. But I really like this team. I think it will be a top contender throughout the year. They have a lot of good players, good structure, and obviously they're projected the most week 1. So yeah, off to a good start. Well, we'll see if they actually win, but looks like they will be off to a good start. Next up, the only other person in the top tier is RageAgainstWeirdo's team, which has Jamar Chase on it. They're projected 115.06, so right above that threshold. But they, again, also have a solid team. Obviously, there's some scare about Jamar Chase, but overall, I really like this team. I think Brock Bowers has some good upside, so there's actually some potential to have a higher projected going down the road, because if Brock Bowers does come out and, have a good year, I think I could see them start projecting him in the teens, which would mean that he might be projected in the 120s eventually. So we'll see how that plays out as we go forward. But overall, I really like this team. Some of the projections looks like they have changed, but I'm going to be going off the original projections I made when I made this list. So oops. Next up is KMoneyTheRichOG's team, which is projected 114.05, slightly different now. But as you can see, Justin Jefferson was the first round pick. And again, I think this is a pretty solid team. There are some depth concerns at running back, having only 3 running backs. But overall, I think it's kind of hard to complain when you got a pretty solid starting team. And since you can start 4 wide receivers, I'm not too worried about the running backs. That said, only having 2 starting running backs on the roster and only having 1 backup running back on the bench is a little bit of concern. But we'll see how that plays out. I'm definitely excited to see how these teams all play out going forward. Next is JennWeng's team, who is projected 113.95. Obviously, again, that's changed a little bit, but they drafted AJ Brown in the first round, and they also got Gibbs in the second. I really like that value. They also got Debo in the third. I mean, overall, very, very solid team. They have some really high upside players, and this is probably one of my favorite teams. I think besides drafting the backup QB and backup tight end, which as you may know, I am not a huge fan of in 1 QB leagues, especially when there's 12 people in the league and you can pick up a QB for bye weeks off the waiver wire, and there's only 5 bench spots. But I think the starters on this team are some of my favorite, and overall, yeah, it's just a really exciting high upside team, and I'm very excited to see how this team does. Next up is Naples Team, who got Christian McCaffrey with the 101 pick. This was a Niners fan, so I know they were very happy to get the 101 pick and get Christian McCaffrey. I don't think there's any wrong picks with drafting Christian McCaffrey. They're projected 113.52 points. And yeah, overall, I think this is a solid team. I think the starters are the strength. Again, I'm not a huge fan of the backup QB, backup tight end, especially in the 5 bench spots. Also, on top of that, having one person on the PUP and then one person that's been dealing with injury limits your flexibility with your starting lineup. So I'm definitely very concerned with that, but who knows? I think there are good players on the waiver wire, so maybe they'll figure out their QB, figure out their tight end, and then drop the one they're not playing, pick up someone that can be a starter right away. So I'm definitely curious to see how this team does. And yeah, I think overall, some good players on the starting lineup. Might lack a little depth for what I like in a fantasy team, but overall, not too bad. I think it's a pretty solid team. The last team in the second tier is Danbledore's team, which is projected 113.33. Looks like that may have changed again a little bit, but I'm not redoing the math or the graphic for this, so you're gonna have to live with these projections that I originally did. They drafted Tyreek Hill in the first round, got some pretty good value. I like Devontae Smith. Getting them in the third round is a pretty good pick, especially since they got Josh Allen, and they're a Josh Allen fan. I was surprised by the George Kittle pick because they picked George Kittle over Dalton Kincaid, and typically in drafts that I've seen, Kincaid is going before George Kittle, so that was very surprising for me, but hey, what can you do? I think overall, some pretty solid starters. I think the bench has way too many tight ends, especially because he has Kittle. I don't think there's any reason to grab Mike Gesicki way before his ADP. This was probably the most shocking pick I saw in the draft. I think it was the biggest difference between where he drafted him and the ADP, because I think he goes undrafted in most leagues, and he got him in like round 10, I think. I could be wrong about that, but it was very, very, very early. I'll just say that. And then he also got Luke Musgrave. So I think his bench is very, very shallow. He only has 3 running backs and 5 wide receivers, so that's a little concerning, especially also having Jared Goff when you have Josh Allen. You don't really need Jared Goff because I don't think there's any reason or way you're gonna play Jared Goff over Josh Allen besides his bye, and I think he has a late bye week, week 12. So especially having Josh Allen be your second round pick, which is very early, I don't see any reason to get Jared Goff, but hey, maybe he knows something I don't. Maybe he knows Josh Allen is going to get hurt and he wants to get Jared Goff. I'm assuming he doesn't want that to happen, but you never know. Anyways, I think some of the picks are solid, but I do think, at least for this team surprised me for being up higher in the projections. I guess it is because the starters are so strong. That said, I'm not a huge fan of the bench, and I'm definitely concerned the long run with the team and flexibility of the roster, especially the bench. So yeah, not one of my favorite teams, but obviously I've been wrong many times before, so you never know. Anyways, next tier, I am at the top of this tier because I drafted Bijan Robinson, and I just like Bijan Robinson, so yeah, that's why I drafted him. No other major comment about that. Got very lucky with Puka Nacua falling, so I'm surprised my projection was only 111.3, but that said, I think it's probably because my QB is Jade Daniels, who I got incredibly late. I'm not too worried about his points. I think he'll be a pretty solid floor play with some upside, so I really like it, but yeah, I mean, I can understand why my projection's a little lower. I did get Kincaid, who I really like at tight end, so not worrying there. And then as you can see on my bench, got Jonathan Brooks, who I think is a really good bench running back because obviously he's out for the first 4 weeks at least, but being the first running back drafted in this year's draft, I think he has some really high upside, and I think he could eventually be in my flex. My only concern is Rome Odunze starting off a little bit slow, but hey, what can you do? I like Rome Odunze and I wanted to get him, so I got him, but we'll see what happens happens. I'm a little worried about the start of the year for me, but I think over the season, I think my team will get stronger. And yeah, we'll just have to see how that plays out. The second team in this tier is Pawninq's team, who drafted CeeDee Lamb in the first round. And I think they've got a pretty solid team. I really like their bench. They have a lot of depth. And I think some of the people have some high upside. I think, yes, they are a little bit older, like Adam Thielen and Austin Eckler, but who knows? They could start off hot, and then next week they're playing them as starters. And on top of that, they have Malik Neighbors and Xavier Worthy, who are some great high upside rookies. And I really think long run that will balance out the older guys on the bench. So I kind of really like this team long run. Obviously, they have some rookies in the short run that might not play as well, but I think this team is going to be long run a contender. We'll obviously have to wait and see if that pans out. You never know with these things, because I remember last year I did some rankings for the league and they didn't turn out so well. Some of the teams I thought would do really well ended up getting kind of unlucky, but also just not as good. They didn't play as well. So I was definitely a little off on some of the projections. I think the first place team I had projected in the bottom 4 or something. So yeah, we'll see how they turn out, but I like this team. I think it's a pretty solid team. The next team in this tier is Mmcgrath 35. So they drafted Garrett Wilson in the first round. I think this team is very interesting. I'm not a fan of the 3 tight ends, especially after drafting 2 elite tight ends. I think that's really going to cap the long-term upside. Even though I like Sam Laporta and Evan Ingram, I think the wide receivers around Evan Ingram at that time had some more upside and had the potential to be getting more than just around 10 points. So I'm not a huge fan of that, and I just think it will cap some of the upside going forward, especially the Taysom Hill pick. I think Taysom Hill in these types of formats where you can start him at tight end is a solid pick if you don't have a tight end, but I just can't see a world you're ever starting Taysom Hill. We kind of already know what he is. So yeah, I'm just not a huge fan of the Taysom Hill pick, but hey, I could be wrong. He has some upside on the bench. Xavier Legette, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Trey Benson. I think those are all some very high upside picks. Obviously, Brian Thomas. Got a lot of young players on this team. So I'm not super opposed to the rest of the lineup. I'm personally not a fan of the 3 tight ends, especially the 2 elite tight ends in this type of league. But obviously, since it is 2 flex spots, you could get away with it. I'm not entirely opposed to it. Now, the last team in this tier, projected 109.4, is Brookezylaphone team, which has Breece Hall picked in the first round. I personally like a lot of the players they have. I think they have some good upside players. I like Ladd McConkey, Jaden Reed, Gus Edwards. I think some of the players on the bench have that upside. I also actually do not mind drafting Kirk Cousins when you have Anthony Richardson. Obviously, last year, the injury history, there's also concerns of how he's been playing. I do think Anthony Richardson was a huge faller in this draft. So I personally like the Anthony Richardson pick. I think the projection is going to be low because some of the flex spots are just not projected the most. DeAndre Swift isn't projected the most, but overall, I'm not too opposed. I know Kyle Pitts is possibly injured though, so that could be a concern. So they may have to turn to the waiver wire early and pick up a tight end. But we'll see what happens. I think this team's pretty solid, and I think they definitely have some potential. I think their depth is pretty good. They have the potential for some of their depth players to become actual starters on their team. So I like that. We'll see how it goes. And now we go to the last tier, which I don't think these teams are bad. So I think these teams still have that potential. I just think they might have some more time to develop. We'll say that. We'll say time to develop. So the first team is TAC 1421's team. Yeah. So Troy's team, he has Jonathan Taylor as his first pick. I think he is going all out on the Bengals here. He's obviously a Bengals fan, so I don't mind this. I think this is fine. All these Bengal players are solid. I do think Joe Burrow was just drafted too early, and that's essentially why his upside's kind of capped. It's essentially losing a 3rd round pick for what could have been probably a 7th round pick, I think. I think that's where Joe Burrow was going. So I think that's the downside, but he wanted to get him, and there was some concern about some other people in the league taking Joe Burrow from him. So I definitely think it wasn't the worst. I think the point of fantasy is to have fun. You got to get your players, and Joe Burrow and T. Higgins and Zach Moss and Jermaine Burton are his guys. So you got to get them, I do like the depth on the bench. I don't like Tua. I mean, I like Tua, but I just don't think he's going to play him above Burrow. I think he could pick up a quarterback if Joe Burrow gets hurt or something like that. So I'm not a huge fan of the Tua pick, but I like, honestly, most of the other players. I think they're all good players. I think that upside was a little hindered by drafting Joe Burrow so high. Also, he drafted Elijah Mitchell in the second to last round, not realizing he was out for the year. So thankfully he got Jordan Mason, who I actually do think is a really good pick. So I think that's completely fine. Essentially the same idea. You get the Niners backup running back, which is Jordan Mason. And honestly, he's looked pretty good. So overall, I think he has a lot of upside. I think this team is one that could get better over the year. I do think the Joe Burrow pick was just early, but overall still a good pick. I really like him this year to bounce back and have a good fantasy season. Now the last projected team with 105.62 is Ricknolle's team, which drafted Saquon Barkley. So he drafted Saquon Barkley in the first round. Obviously, he's at the 1-2 turn, so he got Marvin Harrison as well. Some of the projection is just having these younger players. Also drafting Brock Purdy as a backup was an interesting pick. I'm not a fan of that, but obviously he's a Niners fan. So I think what he should have done if he wanted Brock Purdy is just not draft Dak Prescott, because then he could have gotten a solid player earlier in the draft. And yeah, I think that would have just worked out. Maybe replace Najee Harris. I'm not sure. Depends on the projection and who the player is. Or just gotten a better tight end, because I don't think Pat Freiermuth is going to be a weekly starter at the tight end position. I think it's more of a streaming matchup play. So in that sense, I'm not opposed to drafting Ben Sinnott to hopefully get that upside player, upside tight end. If Ben Sinnott is better than we'd expect his rookie year, then you do have a starting tight end. So I don't mind drafting 2 tight ends in this situation. I think some of the bench players are good. J.K. Dobbins could get a bigger role. I think Chase Brown could be the starting running back. And then Rashid Shaheed is just a solid plug-and-play player, I believe. So overall, I really like the team. I think the only thing is the 2 Houston receivers. I'm not a huge fan of drafting 2 receivers from the same team in a normal fantasy football league, because it's going to be hard to know who to start. You're just going to have to play both, and most of the time they probably won't both do well. So you're kind of capping your upside, maybe getting a safer floor, but at the same time, if Houston has a bad week, then both of them could do bad. So I don't even know if it is a safer floor in that regard. I do really like the Texans players though, especially Tank Dell. I really like Tank Dell. I was hoping to get him in the 6th round, I believe, and he drafted him at the end of the 5th. So honestly, pretty good player. I really like him, but yeah, overall, I think it is a decent team. I think if you're going to aim for getting Brock Purdy, you probably shouldn't draft Dak Prescott. So that's my only critique of the team. Overall, I actually don't think this team is that bad. I think it's just one of those projection teams where it doesn't project out as well as I think it will perform, because a lot of these players, not as high projection as you might think. Like Saquon Barkley probably could get a lot more, or Rachaad White, especially PPR. I think Marvin Harrison will ramp up as the season goes on. So honestly, pretty solid team, just lacking at tight end, and probably shouldn't have 2 quarterbacks. But overall, that's the league. I really am excited to do this podcast. Hopefully have some guests on, talk about the league every week. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next week of the Fantasy Football League.